Cowboy found a 15-day-old baby abandoned. On Roadside, the note beside her changed everything. The dust came in like a curtain being pulled across the sky. One moment, Caleb Rusk could see the flat brown stretch of land all the way to the far ridge. The next, the world shrank down to about 20 feet in every direction, and everything beyond that was just brown and howling. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and squinted against the grit. His horse, a big roan gelding named Scout, tucked his head low and kept moving. Scout had been through enough storms to know that fighting the wind was a waste of good energy. The cattle were not so wise. There were 43 head in the drive, and every last one of them wanted to go somewhere different. They bumped against each other, rolled their eyes white, and bawled into the wind. Caleb rode the rear, moving left and right, keeping the stragglers pushed forward. His two hired hands, young brothers named Cord and Pete, worked the flanks up ahead, though he could barely see them through the brown haze. He could hear their whistles, faint and distant, swallowed up almost as fast as they were made. He knew this road. He had tried hard to forget it, but the land had a long memory, and so did he. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story 3 years ago, on a morning that started out bright and calm. He had traveled this same stretch of wagon road behind a different kind of procession. No cattle that day, just a simple pine box on a borrowed flatbed, and Caleb riding behind it with his hat pressed against his chest and nothing left inside him worth naming. Mary, and the child she carried. He had buried them both beneath the big cottonwood at the edge of the Mercy Bend Cemetery, and then he had ridden home and closed the nursery door and not opened it since. The storm had pushed him onto this road because the main trail was blocked. A washed-out gully, fresh from last week's rain, sat right across the path his cattle needed to take. This road was the only way through. Caleb had sat on Scout for a long minute when he saw that, jaw tight, looking at the detour. Then he clicked his tongue and turned the herd. There was no sense in arguing with the land. He was thinking about nothing in particular, just watching the rear of the herd and breathing through the bandana when the calf broke. It was a young red one, barely 3 months old, and it spooked at something in the wind. Maybe a sound, maybe just the storm itself pressing in too close. It shot sideways out of the herd and ran hard toward the far edge of the road where an old broken wagon sat half buried in drifted dust and dry brush. Caleb turned Scout without thinking and went after it. The calf did not go far. It stopped near the wagon wheel, trembling, and Caleb came up beside it and turned it back with a nudge of his boot. He whistled for Cord to collect the animal and started to wheel Scout around. Then he heard it, a high, thin sound, like a rusty hinge swinging in the wind. He stopped. He heard it again. His stomach went cold. That was not a hinge. He swung down from Scout and dropped the reins. The wind pushed hard against his back as he moved toward the wagon. The canvas that had once covered the wagon bed was torn and flapping, half of it buried in dust. The wagon tongue was cracked clean through. Whatever horse had pulled this thing, it had been gone a long time. Caleb crouched down and pulled the loose edge of the canvas aside. There, tucked against the inside wall of the wagon bed, wrapped inside a flour sack, was a baby. She was very small. Smaller than Caleb had imagined a person could be and still be alive. Her face was red from crying and dusted with grit. Her lips were dry and cracked. Her tiny fists shook with each weak, desperate sound she made. He stared at her. He did not move for a full breath. Then her eyes opened and looked at nothing in particular, and she cried again, and the sound of it cut straight through him like a cold knife through warm bread. He looked around the wagon, checking the ground, checking the road. No horse, no rider, no wagon tracks he could follow. The storm had erased everything. He looked back at the baby, tucked just beneath her right hand, folded once, and held in place by nothing more than the gentle weight of her fingers, was a small square of paper. Caleb reached in carefully and picked it up. He unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven, shaky, like someone writing in a hurry or in fear. Maybe both. Do not let Judge Bellamy know she lived. Caleb read it twice. Judge Elias Bellamy. He had heard enough stories about that man to know what the name meant in this part of the territory. Farmers who entered Bellamy's courtroom with a debt came out without their land. Widows who asked for help from the county fund somehow ended up owing the county more than they borrowed. Men who challenged him in public had a way of disappearing from respectable company very quickly, and a few had disappeared from the territory altogether. Caleb was not a man who scared easily. He had survived a cavalry campaign, 2 droughts, and a grief so heavy it had nearly crushed the breath out of him. But the name on that note made something cold settle in the back of his throat. The smart thing was to ride to town, hand the baby to someone official, file a report. Let the right people deal with it. He folded the note and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He looked at the baby again. She had stopped crying for a moment, spent from the effort. Her tiny chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Her fists had relaxed just slightly. Caleb reached into the wagon bed and slid one hand beneath her head and the other beneath her small wrapped body, the way he had watched Mary hold a neighbor's newborn once, a long time ago. His hands felt too big, too rough, too clumsy for something this fragile. He lifted her out of the flour sack wrapping and brought her up against his chest. She startled. Her fingers spread wide for a half second. Then her hand found his thumb, and those tiny fingers curled around it and held on. Caleb stood there in the roaring dust with a baby pressed against his coat and a note against his heart, and he did not move for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to Scout, climbed up carefully with one arm holding the child close, and pointed the horse toward home. Not toward town, toward home. The ranch house sat dark against the bruised evening sky when Caleb came up the trail. The storm had thinned some, but not quit. Dust still hissed across the porch boards and rattled the window shutters. Scout nickered at the barn, and Caleb tied him quick, promising feed with a pat on the neck, then carried the baby up the porch steps and pushed inside with his shoulder. The house was cold. He had not lit a fire that morning. He never bothered much with fires when it was only him coming home. He stood just inside the door and looked around the dim kitchen like he was seeing it for the first time. The table, the single chair pulled up to it, one tin cup on the shelf, one plate. One of everything, because one was all he needed. The baby made a small sound against his chest. Not a full cry, just a warning. "All right," Caleb said quietly. "All right." He moved to the table and tried to figure out how to set her down without hurting her. He ended up lowering himself into the chair first and resting her across his lap while he got his coat off one arm at a time. She weighed almost nothing. That fact frightened him more than anything else so far. He needed milk. He knew that much. He had a half-full jar of cow's milk in the cold box, left from 2 days ago. He found a small pot, poured some in, and set it on the stove after he got a fire going one-handed, which took 3 times as long as it should have, because he was afraid to put the baby down on the hard kitchen floor. He finally laid her on the folded corner of his coat on the table. She protested immediately. "Just for a minute," he told her. Just 1 minute. She did not agree with that. He got the fire going and watched the milk in the pot, not sure how hot it needed to be. He tested a drop on his wrist, the way he had once seen a woman do in town, and pulled his hand back sharp. Too hot. He moved the pot off the heat and waited. Then he waited longer. Then he tried again, and it had gone cold. He said something under his breath that he would not have said in front of Mary. He had no bottle, no proper feeding cloth. He looked around the kitchen and found a small ladle and a clean rag and tried to drip warm milk onto the rag and press it gently to the baby's lips. Some of it went in. Most of it ran down the side of her face and soaked into his coat. She sputtered and turned her head and cried harder. "I know," Caleb said. "I know, I'm sorry." His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. The house pressed in around him. He had spent 3 years making peace with the silence here. He had gotten used to the creak of the floorboards and the wind under the door, and nothing else. Now the baby's crying filled every corner, and instead of being too much noise, it somehow made the emptiness feel worse. He walked through the house with her against his chest, trying to remember where Mary had kept extra cloths and blankets. The bedroom had some. He found a soft shirt of his own and tore it into squares, clumsy and quick. But he needed something softer for wrapping her, something warm. He stood in the hallway and looked at the closed door at the end of it. He had not opened that door in 3 years. His hand found the latch anyway. The nursery smelled like cedar and something faint and sweet that he could not name but recognized down in his bones. The cradle he had built that last winter sat in the corner, still smooth and solid. Mary's quilt lay folded over the side rail. Blue and white squares, tiny, careful stitches. A small shelf held clothes that had never been worn, folded neat, waiting on a child who never came home. Caleb stood in the doorway and could not move. The baby cried. He stepped inside. He took the quilt from the cradle rail and carried it back to the kitchen, and he cleaned the baby as gently as he knew how, with the torn cloth and a bowl of warmed water. He checked her over carefully. This tiny girl no one had claimed. Her color was better now. Her cries had quieted to soft, tired sounds. He carried her back to the nursery and laid her in the cradle. She looked very small in it. He stood over her for a long moment, one hand resting on the cradle rail, and he tried to think of what to call her. He did not know her name. He did not know her family. He did not know a single thing about her, except that she had been left in a storm with a warning note, and she had curled her fingers around his thumb like she already trusted him. He could not explain how she had survived out there. He could not explain why he had found her. He could not explain any of it. "Grace," he said quietly. The baby blinked up at the ceiling. "That's what you are," he told her. "So, that's what I'll call you." Caleb did not sleep so much as drift. He sat in the old rocking chair he had pulled close to the cradle, and every time Grace made a sound, he was awake before his eyes were fully open. By the 3rd hour, he stopped trying to sleep at all and just sat, watching her chest rise and fall in the pale dark. When the sun finally crept through the nursery window, he felt it on the side of his face and realized he had been holding his breath for most of the night. Grace was alive, still breathing, still small. He stood slowly, every joint in his body complaining, and leaned over the cradle. She blinked up at him with dark, unfocused eyes. Her lips were moving like she was practicing something. "You're hungry again," he said. She confirmed it a moment later. He had no more cow's milk that was fresh. What little he had given her through the night had been barely enough, and he knew it. She needed proper feeding. She needed soft cloth and something for her skin, which was dry and a little raw around her wrists. She needed someone who actually knew what they were doing. Caleb needed to go to town. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, thinking about the note. He pulled it from his coat pocket and read it again in the morning light, the handwriting shaky and rushed. "Do not let Judge Bellamy know she lived." He refolded it carefully. Then he crossed to the far corner of the kitchen, crouched down, and worked the loose floorboard up with his thumbnail. The gap beneath was shallow, dusty, and dry. He had kept a few dollars there once, a long time ago. He pressed the note flat, laid it in the gap, and set the board back in place. Then he looked at Grace and tried to figure out how to carry a newborn on horseback without doing something he could never take back. He ended up fashioning a kind of sling from one of his old flannel shirts, tucking her against his chest and knotting the fabric behind his back. It was not pretty. But when he stood up straight and walked across the kitchen, Grace did not slide and did not cry. She made a small sound that might have been approval. He wrapped her outer layer in Mary's quilt, pulling the corners up around her head to keep the morning wind off her face. His hands moved slowly. He tried not to think about whose quilt it was. He tried not to think about much of anything except the road ahead. He saddled Scout with one arm as best he could, and the horse had the good sense not to cause trouble. Mercy Bend was 2 miles down the main road, and Caleb kept Scout to a slow walk the whole way. Every rut in the road made him tense. He rode with one hand on the reins and one hand pressed flat against Grace's back, feeling her breathe. The town woke up around him as he came down the main street. A few men were sweeping boardwalks. A dog crossed the road. The smell of frying pork drifted from the cookhouse window. He tied Scout at the rail in front of Holt's Mercantile and went inside. The bell above the door had barely finished ringing before the room changed. A woman near the dry goods shelf turned around and froze. Another one, closer to the window, made a soft sound and took a step toward him. Old Pete Granger, who came in every morning for tobacco, looked up from the counter and stared. Caleb stood in the middle of it all holding a newborn wrapped in a blue and white quilt, trying to look like this was a perfectly ordinary thing. "I need goat's milk," he said, "and some soft cloth, and whatever else a person needs for a baby this size." Nobody moved for a breath. Then everybody moved at once. 2 women were in front of him before he finished the sentence, reaching for the quilt to peek at Grace, speaking over each other in quick, high voices. A third came from the back room, having already heard the commotion somehow. Grace blinked at all of them without fussing, which struck Caleb as braver than anything he had managed so far. The men handled it differently. They pulled back, moved to the edges of the room, tilted their heads together and spoke low. Caleb caught pieces of it. Rusk, alone out there, 3 years, now a baby. He ignored them and focused on the women, trying to answer their questions as simply as he could. No, he did not know her mother. Yes, he found her. No, he did not know how old exactly, but small. Very small. He did not mention the note. He did not mention Judge Bellamy. He became aware of a man standing near the front window. Not shopping, not talking. Just standing with his arms crossed, watching. The man had a flat, hard face under the brim of a dark hat. A badge caught the light, though it sat slightly crooked on his vest, like it had been pinned on as an afterthought. His eyes were not on Caleb. They were on Grace. Silas Drum. Caleb had seen him twice before. Once outside the courthouse, and once on the road near the Halverson place. The week-old Jim Halverson lost his land to back taxes. Drum had not done any of the legal talking that day. He had just stood nearby with that same flat expression, making sure Jim understood how things were. Caleb turned away from him and focused on the counter. A woman stepped in from his left. She was somewhere in her early 50s, with sharp gray eyes and hair pinned back without a strand out of place. She wore a plain dark dress and carried herself like someone who had spent 30 years making sure other people did what they were supposed to do. She looked at the baby, then at Caleb, and her expression managed to be both disapproving and completely in command at the same moment. "You heated the milk too hot and then let it go cold," she said. It was not a question. Caleb opened his mouth. "I can tell by the corner of her mouth," Miriam Vale said. "She's been working too hard for too little. Step aside." She did not wait for him to step aside. She moved past him to the shelf and began pulling items down with the certainty of someone who had made this list many times before. Goat's milk in a sealed tin, a length of soft white flannel, a small clay jar of salve, a narrow feeding spoon, She set each item on the counter with a firm click. "Warm the milk to the inside of your wrist," she said, not looking at him. "Not the back of your hand. Your wrist. If it stings, it's too hot. If you feel nothing, start over." She turned and looked at him directly. "Can you remember that?" "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "Wrap her snugly, but leave room for her chest to move. She is not a bedroll." She glanced down at Mary's quilt and the flannel shirt sling, and something shifted briefly in her expression. She paid for the items herself before Caleb could get his money out, which annoyed him, and handed him the bundle with both hands. "Come by the schoolhouse this evening," she said quietly. "I'll show you the rest." She said it plainly, the way she might have told a student where to find a missing assignment. There was no fuss in it, no performance, but her voice had dropped just enough that only he heard it. Caleb nodded once and tucked the bundle under his arm. He thanked the women still hovering near him, said something vague to Pete Granger, and pushed through the door back into the morning air. He untied Scout, settled Grace carefully against his chest, and swung up into the saddle. As he turned the horse toward the road home, he heard the sound of boots on the boardwalk behind him. Slow, deliberate. He did not look back, but he heard the footsteps stop, pause for a moment, and then move off in a different direction. Toward the far end of the street, toward the courthouse. Caleb pressed his hand against Grace's back and kept riding. Caleb got back to the ranch a little past noon. He laid Grace down on the kitchen table, which was flat and wide and the safest surface he could think of, and spread the flannel Miriam had bought beside her. Grace looked up at the ceiling with the calm, distant expression of someone who had decided to reserve judgment. He warmed the milk the way Miriam told him. Wrist, not hand. He tested it twice. The second time it felt right, just barely warm, not stinging, not cold. He coaxed the spoon to Grace's lips and she took it. Then she took another. He kept going, slow and steady, until she turned her head away and closed her eyes. He sat back in the chair and let out a long breath. She slept. He watched her for a while to make sure, then stood up carefully and moved to the window. The storm had blown itself out overnight. The yard was pale and dusty, the fence posts wearing a thin coat of red grit. The sky had gone flat and white. Scout stood at the water trough with his head down. Caleb was still watching the yard when he heard hoofbeats coming up the road. Miriam Vale came through the gate on a brown mare with a canvas bag over one arm and the same settled expression she had worn in the mercantile. She did not look like a woman who had decided to make an extra trip. She looked like a woman who had made a decision and was carrying it out. Caleb opened the door before she could knock. She looked at him, then past him at Grace, sleeping on the table. "Good," she said. She fed. "Yes, ma'am." Miriam stepped inside, set her bag on the chair by the door, and pulled out a clean square of cotton cloth. She handed it to Caleb and then positioned herself beside Grace with the quiet authority of someone who had done this many times before. "Watch carefully," she said. "I will only show you once." She showed him twice. She walked him through the swaddle slowly, explaining each fold and tuck, while her hands moved with calm precision. She showed him how to keep the cloth snug across the chest without pulling tight. She showed him how to support the head when lifting, and how to hold the baby against his chest so Grace could feel warmth rather than just weight. She corrected the angle of his elbow without embarrassment, the way she might correct a student's grip on a pencil. Caleb paid attention. He had spent his life learning things with his hands, cattle work, fencing, farriery, and he understood that watching closely the first time saved trouble later. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He just watched and did what she showed him. When it came time to change the flour sack that had been wrapped around Grace beneath the outer layers, Miriam lifted the baby gently and set the sack aside on the table. She reached for the fresh flannel. Then she stopped. Her hand hovered for a moment. She picked up the flour sack and turned it toward the light from the window. She was quiet for a breath, then another. "Where exactly did you find her?" Miriam asked. Her voice had not changed in volume, but something in it had gone very still. "Old Wagon Road," Caleb said. "East Fork, past the dry creek bed." Miriam turned the sack so he could see the faded stamp on the bottom corner. "Willow Creek Mill, WCM." "This flour sack came from Willow Creek Mill," she said. "Tessa May Cobb runs it now, after her husband passed. The mill supplied flour to a handful of families and properties in this valley." She set the sack down flat on the table and smoothed it with one hand. One of those properties was Willow Spring Homestead, the Whitcomb family land. Caleb looked at the stamp. "Sarah Whitcomb died of fever 2 winters ago," Miriam continued. "Her daughter Anna was said to have lost her baby in childbirth. No living heir. That is what the court records say." She paused. "Judge Bellamy filed a claim on Willow Spring not long after. Unpaid taxes, abandoned ownership." Caleb looked at Grace, sleeping against his chest. "If this baby came from that homestead," he said slowly, "then there may be a living heir after all," Miriam said. "And if there is a living heir, Judge Bellamy's claim has no ground to stand on." Caleb had made up his mind to go alone. He told Miriam as much, standing in the kitchen while Grace slept in the cradle in the next room. He said it would be faster with just one horse, that he would be back before noon, and that there was no reason to drag a newborn to a flour mill on a cold morning. Miriam looked at him the way she looked at students who had given a wrong answer with complete confidence. "The flour sack is the only thing we have," she said. "I am coming with you, and so is she." Caleb opened his mouth. "She cannot be left alone," Miriam said simply. "And I will not leave her with a man who, 3 days ago, did not know how to test milk temperature." There was no good argument against that. Caleb got the horses ready. They rode into Mercy Bend by the back road, the long way around that swung wide of the courthouse, and came in through the mill side of town near the creek. The main road was quieter than usual, but Caleb kept his eyes moving. Silas Drum had a habit of appearing where he was least wanted, leaning in doorways, watching from under the brim of his hat, like a man who was paid to notice things. They did not see him. That did not mean he did not see them. Willow Creek Mill sat at the bend of a shallow creek that was running low this time of year. The building was old but kept up, the boards patched and repainted where weather had gotten into them. A sign above the door read, "Cobb's Mill," in faded black letters. A rope of dried corn hung beside the entrance, more habit than decoration. Tessa May Cobb was stacking empty sacks near the side door when they arrived. She was a small woman, somewhere in her mid-40s, with flour dust on her apron and tired eyes that had the particular look of someone who slept lightly and worried often. When she saw Caleb and Miriam ride up with a baby wrapped at Miriam's chest, she stopped stacking. "Morning, Tessa," Miriam said. Tessa nodded. She looked at the baby, then at Caleb. "I heard you found a child," she said to Caleb. Her voice was careful. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. He dismounted and reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out the flour sack, still folded the way Miriam had set it aside, and held it out. Tessa's hands went still. She looked at the stamp on the corner of the sack. Willow Creek Mill, WCM. Her expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did. She took a small step back, just one, the kind a person takes without deciding to. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "Wrapped around the baby when I found her," Caleb said quietly. "Out on the East Fork Wagon Road." Tessa looked at Grace. She looked at the sack again. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. "We need to know who received flour from this lot," Miriam said. "We are not here to cause trouble, Tessa. We are here because a baby was left in a ditch and someone put her in that sack because they wanted her to survive the trip." Tessa was quiet for a long moment. A wind pushed through the creek brush and rustled the dry corn on the wall. Grace made a small sound against Miriam's chest and settled again. Then Tessa let out a slow breath and her shoulders came down. "2 weeks ago," she said. Her voice had dropped low enough that Caleb took a step closer to hear her. "A woman came here. She was not from town, or if she was, I did not recognize her. She was not asking for flour. She said she only needed a clean sack, a good one, not torn." Tessa paused. "She said, a baby deserves better than a rag if she has to travel." Caleb went very still. Tessa walked inside without another word. They followed her into the dim cool of the mill. She went to a shelf behind the grinding table and pulled out a flat tin box. From it, she took a folded receipt. She held it out to Caleb. It was a charity receipt. "Flour delivered to Mercy Refuge, home for widows." The signature at the bottom was written in tight, practiced letters. "Eudora Clasp, Matron." Caleb folded the receipt carefully and put it in his coat pocket. They walked back out into the morning light. Tessa stood in the doorway of the mill with her arms crossed, not against the cold, but against something else. "You should know something," she said. "Bellamy holds debts over half this town. My husband's debts included." She looked at Caleb steadily. "Any person who threatens that land at Willow Spring will not just face the judge in a courtroom. They will find their credit gone, their contracts pulled, and their name dragged through every ear between here and the county seat." She looked at Grace one more time. "I gave you that receipt because my conscience told me to, but I want you to understand what you are walking into." The ride home was quiet. Caleb kept his eyes on the road and his thoughts on the receipt folded inside his coat. Miriam rode beside him with Grace tucked carefully against her chest, the baby sleeping through the movement of the horse like she had been born to it. The afternoon light was going gold and thin, and the wind off the fields carried the smell of dry grass and coming cold. Nobody spoke until the ranch came into view. Inside, Miriam settled Grace into the cradle and then stood at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, looking at the receipt and the flour sack laid side by side. Caleb poured 2 cups of water because it was something to do with his hands. He set one in front of her and stayed standing. "We have the sack," Miriam said. "We have the receipt. We have Tessa's word for whatever she is willing to give in public." She tapped the edge of the receipt with one finger. "None of it yet tells us who that child is. Not in any way a court would accept. It tells us enough to start asking," Caleb said. "It tells us enough to get you charged." Miriam looked up at him. "Think clearly. Bellamy controls this court. He controls the clerk, the deputy, and the filing records. If you go in there with a flour sack and a charity receipt and a baby you cannot legally account for, he will not see a man trying to help. He will see a man who handed him exactly the story he needs." She let that sit for a moment. Kidnapping, unlawful concealment, a grieving widower gone unstable. He could write that story in his sleep. Caleb knew she was right. That was the part that sat like a stone in his chest. He was about to say so when he heard wheels on the dirt road outside. He went to the window. A black carriage was coming up the ranch road at an unhurried pace, the kind of pace that said the man inside it did not expect obstacles. It was pulled by a pair of matched bays, well fed and well kept. Even before it stopped, Caleb knew who it belonged to. There was not another carriage like it in 3 counties. Miriam appeared at his shoulder. She looked out, and her expression did not change, but her voice dropped. "Do not say anything about the note," she said quietly. Caleb moved to the door. Judge Elias Bellamy stepped down from the carriage with the ease of a man who was accustomed to people watching him arrive. He was tall and lean, dressed in a dark coat that had not seen trail dust in years. His boots were polished to a shine that seemed almost insulting out here in the dirt. He carried a hat in one hand and wore a patient, civil smile that did not touch his eyes. He looked at the ranch the way a man looks at something he is already calculating the value of. "Rusk," he said pleasantly, "I hope I am not catching you at a bad hour." "You are," Caleb said. Bellamy smiled a little wider, as if that were charming. He came to the foot of the porch steps and stopped there, looking up at Caleb with that same careful, polished calm. "I have had reports," he said, "that you found an abandoned infant out on the East Fork Road. A troubling situation, of course. I wanted to come personally to make sure the child is being properly looked after." He tilted his head slightly. "Foundlings fall under court protection, Rusk. That is not my preference. It is the law. Any abandoned child must be surrendered to proper custody until her identity can be established through legal process." "She is being looked after," Caleb said. "I am glad to hear it." Bellamy's voice stayed pleasant. "I would like to see her." "No." The smile held, but something behind it shifted. Just slightly. The way a calm surface shifts when something moves underneath it. "Grief does things to a man," Bellamy said, his voice going softer in a way that felt worse than if he had shouted. "I know your history, Rusk. I know what you lost. The court would understand if your judgment has been, affected. But unlawful concealment of a foundling carries real consequences. Serious ones." He let the pause stretch. "I would hate to see a man of your standing brought low over a child that was never his to keep." Caleb held the doorframe and said nothing. Bellamy held his gaze for another moment. Then he put his hat back on, adjusted the brim with 2 fingers, and turned back toward the carriage. "You have until morning to reconsider," he said without turning around. Caleb watched the carriage roll back down the road until the dark swallowed it. He stood on the porch for a while after that, listening to the night settle in around the ranch. Then he went to check on Grace. She was still sleeping. Her small chest rose and fell in a steady, soft rhythm. He stood over the cradle for a moment and just watched her breathe. When he went back outside to latch the barn for the night, he almost missed it. It was nailed to the center of the barn door at eye level. A crow, black and stiff, pinned through the wing with a short iron nail. Beneath it, a scrap of torn paper had been tucked under the nail head. Caleb pulled the paper free and held it up toward the lantern light. 4 words, written in rough, uneven letters. "The road gives. The road can take back." The night had gone cold and still. Caleb stood in the barn doorway with Grace against his chest, one hand spread across her back the way Miriam had shown him, fingers wide enough to feel her breathing. The lantern behind him threw a long shadow across the yard. He did not look at the barn door. He did not have to. He had already seen what was nailed there. Miriam came out of the barn carrying the dead crow wrapped in a feed cloth. She walked past him without a word, went to the edge of the yard, and buried it under the dirt near the fence post with a few quick moves of a shovel she had found leaning against the wall. She did not make a fuss about it. She just handled it the way she handled most things, quietly and without ceremony, because the job needed doing. When she came back and set the shovel against the porch rail, Caleb finally spoke. "I should have taken her to town," he said. "First morning, any lawful man would have." Miriam looked at him. The lantern light caught the lines around her eyes and the steady set of her mouth. "Any lawful man in this county answers to Elias Bellamy," she said. "And that baby's note told you exactly what that would mean for her." "That does not make what I did legal." "No," she said plainly. "It does not." She folded her arms across her chest and looked out at the dark yard. "But there is a difference between law and righteousness, Caleb. When the law is held in wicked hands, following it blindly is not virtue. It is just obedience dressed up to look like one. She turned back to him. You read that note. You knew what it said. And you made a choice. Caleb looked down at Grace. Her eyes were closed and her mouth was slightly open. One small fist curled against his shirt. She was so light. He still could not quite get used to how light she was. Bellamy will not wait long, he said. No, he will not. Miriam's voice was firm and practical. Which means we cannot wait either. We need to know who she is before he can walk into a courtroom and claim she belongs to nobody. If we can prove her identity, we prove his claim on Willow Spring is built on a lie. That changes everything. She paused. But we have to move carefully. One mistake, and he buries this under paperwork before we can open our mouths. Caleb nodded slowly. He went inside and laid Grace back in the cradle, tucking Mary's quilt up around her shoulders. Then he crossed to the far corner of the kitchen, crouched down, and worked his fingers under the loose floorboard near the wall. The note was where he had left it, folded twice, slightly crumpled from his coat pocket. He brought it to the table and smoothed it flat. Miriam leaned over it. She read it once, then again. Then she set the flour sack beside it and the charity receipt from Tessa beside that. For a long moment, she just looked at the three things laid out together, her brow creased in thought. A warning not to let Bellamy know she lived, she said quietly. A flour sack from a mill tied to the Wickham homestead, and a receipt showing flour delivered to a widow's home 2 weeks ago. She straightened up. There is only one place that can explain the missing mother. Caleb looked at her. Mercy Refuge Home for Widows, Miriam said. The name landed in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. Caleb turned and looked at Grace sleeping in the cradle. The same cradle he had built with his own hands years ago. The same quilt Mary had stitched square by square through the long evenings before everything fell apart. Grace's chest rose and fell. Her lips made a small soft movement in her sleep. He understood then, fully and without question, that the moment he had lifted her out of that dust had not just changed his day, it had changed everything. He leaned down close to the cradle. I won't hand you to the man who wanted you erased, he said. Caleb did not sleep so much as drift. He sat in the wooden chair beside the cradle with his chin dropping to his chest every hour or so, then jerking back up the moment Grace made a sound. By the time pale gray light began pushing through the kitchen window, he had lost count of how many times he had done it. His neck ached. His back ached. His eyes felt like they had been scrubbed with sand. Grace, for her part, seemed unbothered by any of it. She lay in the cradle looking up at the ceiling with the calm, unfocused gaze of someone who had decided the world was acceptable for now, but reserved the right to change her opinion at any moment. Miriam arrived before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She came through the front door without knocking, which Caleb had already learned was simply how Miriam Vale operated. She set a covered pail of fresh goat's milk on the table, unwrapped a bundle of clean folded cloths, and looked at Caleb the way a schoolteacher looks at a student who has clearly not been sleeping the way he was supposed to. You look terrible, she said. Good morning to you too, Caleb said. She almost smiled. Almost. She showed him again how to warm the milk properly. Not too fast, not on the hottest part of the stove, just enough heat to take the chill off. She made him do it himself while she watched with her arms folded. You had it too hot yesterday, she said. I know that now. You'll test it on your wrist before every feeding. Yes, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am. I'm not your school teacher. You are acting exactly like my school teacher, Caleb said. This time she did smile, just a small one, quick and gone. He got the milk right on the second try. Miriam showed him how to fold the cloths into a proper pad so they stayed in place and did not bunch up and irritate the baby's skin. His hands were too big and too rough for the work. The cloth kept slipping. He folded it 3 times before it looked anything like what Miriam demonstrated. "Your fingers were built for fence posts," she observed. "They were," he agreed. Grace fussed while he worked, her face scrunching up in that particular way that meant she was building toward something louder. Caleb picked her up before she got there, which he was quietly proud of. He was starting to learn her rhythms a little, the small warnings that came before the real crying. He held her against his chest and walked slow circles in the kitchen, the way Miriam had shown him the evening before. Grace was not fully settled, still making small, unhappy sounds, so Caleb did the only other thing he could think of. He started to hum. Then, because humming felt awkward and insufficient, he started to sing. It was an old cavalry marching tune, low and steady, not pretty by any measure. His voice was rough and slightly off-key and better suited to calling cattle than soothing a baby. Grace did not seem to care. She quieted on the 3rd verse. Her small body relaxed against his chest, and her breathing slowed to match the rhythm of his walking. Miriam watched from the table and said nothing. There was something careful in her expression, like she was witnessing something that deserved to be left alone. By afternoon, Grace had eaten twice and slept once and cried with real conviction for about 10 minutes before Caleb figured out she was cold at her feet. He warmed them in his palms and felt absurdly pleased when she stopped fussing. He was standing at the window with Grace settled flat against his chest, her cheek pressed over his heartbeat, her eyes closed and her breathing deep and even. The crying had stopped completely. She had just simply gone still, lulled by the steady thud beneath her ear. Caleb reached out with his free hand and pulled open the nursery curtains. He had not touched them in 3 years. The afternoon light came through in a long pale stripe and fell across the floor, across the cradle, across the small quilt folded on the shelf. Miriam looked up from the table. She saw what he had done. She looked back down at the papers in front of her without a word. Outside, past the curtains, a rider moved along the road at the edge of the ranch property. Slow, not passing through, just moving. Caleb watched him without turning his head. He knew the man. He had seen him standing with Silas Drum outside Bellamy's courthouse 2 days before. Caleb did not move from the window. He kept his hand on Grace's back and his eyes on the rider until the man rounded the bend and disappeared. Then he looked down at the baby sleeping against his chest. He had told himself he was doing what any decent person would do. He had told himself it was obligation, duty, the simple moral weight of finding something helpless and not being able to leave it in the road. Those things were true, but they were not the whole truth anymore. He wanted her to be safe, not because it was the right thing, because it was her, because of the way her fist curled when she slept and the way she had gone quiet against his voice, rough and tuneless as it was, and the way the nursery light looked falling across the cradle he had built with his own hands for a child who never came home. This was the first good thing he had wanted to protect since Mary died. Miriam said the name like she had been turning it over in her mind all afternoon. Amos Pike. Caleb looked up from where he was checking Grace's wrapping. The old circuit preacher? The same. Miriam folded the last clean cloth and set it on the shelf. He traveled this valley for 30 years before his hip gave out. Marriages, births, burials, baptisms. He kept records of all of it in his own hand. She paused. If anyone knew the Whitcomb family, it would be Amos. Caleb thought about it for a moment. Outside, the afternoon light was going golden and long. Grace was settled and fed and quiet against his chest. He looked down at her small face, at the tiny crease between her brows that appeared whenever she was on the edge of sleep. All right, he said, let's go see him. The church at the edge of Mercy Bend was a weathered little building with a crooked steeple and a front step that sagged on one side. The paint had given up years ago. The hitching post, leaned at an angle that suggested it had been meaning to fall over for some time but had not quite committed. 2 ancient cottonwood trees stood on either side of the door like tired guards. Amos Pike came around the side of the building when he heard them ride up. He was moving slowly, favoring his left leg, using a walking stick worn smooth from years of use. He was old, his face deeply lined, his white hair pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested he had run his hand through it recently and forgotten about it. But his eyes were clear and dark and sharp, the kind of eyes that noticed things. He looked at Caleb, then at Miriam, then at the bundle against Caleb's chest. "Well," he said, "I heard you found yourself some trouble." "Word travels fast," Caleb said. "Word always travels fast in a small town," Amos replied. "It's the truth that moves slow." He waved them toward the church door. "Come inside. That baby doesn't need the afternoon wind." The inside of the church smelled like candle wax and old wood, and something faintly like cedar. 4 rows of plain benches faced a simple pulpit. A small iron stove stood cold in the corner. Amos lowered himself onto the front bench with the careful patience of a man who had made peace with his body's limitations. Caleb sat across from him and kept Grace close. Miriam stood near the window, watching the road out of habit. Caleb did not waste time. He told Amos what he had found: the baby in the storm, the flour sack, the note with Bellamy's name, the receipt from Tessa May Cobb, pointing to Mercy Refuge, home for widows. Then he said the name: Anna Whitcomb. Amos went still. It was not the stillness of a man who did not know the name. It was the stillness of a man who had been waiting to hear it spoken out loud. "I married her," Amos said quietly. "Anna and Daniel Whitcomb, 6 years ago, near about. Young couple, good people. Daniel worked that spring land with his hands and his whole heart." He paused. "Daniel died the following winter. Fever. Left Anna expecting and alone." He was quiet for a moment. The cottonwood branches moved outside the window. "After the baby was supposed to have come, I asked after her. I was told she lost the child and lost her mind along with it. Wandered off, couldn't be found." He shook his head slowly. "That never sat right with me. Anna Whitcomb was a steady woman. Grief can break a person, I know that as well as anyone. But the story felt too clean, too convenient." He looked at Grace, asleep against Caleb's chest. "If she is alive," he said, "Bellamy will have hidden her under another name. Somewhere he controls. Somewhere she has no voice." Miriam turned from the window. "Mercy Refuge," she said. Amos nodded. "It started as True Charity. Then Bellamy became its court overseer and its money. After that, it became something else." He reached for his walking stick and straightened on the bench. "I will come with you tomorrow," he said, "as a witness." Caleb was up before the sun. He moved through the dark barn by feel, his hands finding the harness straps without needing light. He worked quietly, buckling and checking, running his palm along the horse's flank to settle her. The air was cold and still. The stars were fading out one by one above the open barn door. Grace was inside with Miriam, who had arrived before dawn without being asked. That was Miriam's way. She did not announce herself. She simply appeared where she was needed. Caleb finished harnessing the wagon horse and stood for a moment in the quiet. He thought about the road ahead. He thought about Silas Drum. Silas was the kind of man who liked to show up where he wasn't expected, badge gleaming, hand near his gun, wearing authority like a weapon. Caleb had seen his type before, men who borrowed power from someone meaner and called it their own. He walked the perimeter of the ranch before going back inside. The road beyond the gate was empty, just ruts in dry earth and the sound of wind moving through the grass. Inside, Miriam had Grace wrapped and fed. She was packing a cloth bag with 2 small jars of goat's milk, a folded stack of clean cloths, and the tin of salve. She moved with the efficiency of a woman who had spent decades preparing for things that could not wait. Amos was already at the door when Caleb pulled the wagon around. The old preacher carried his worn prayer book under one arm and his walking stick in the other hand. He climbed up onto the wagon bench slowly, without complaint, settling himself with the patience of a man who had ridden harder roads than this. They set out as the sky turned from black to pale gray. Caleb drove and kept his eyes moving. Every crossroad, every stand of brush, every shadow that might be a man on a horse. Miriam sat in the wagon bed with Grace, speaking softly to her. Amos rode up front beside Caleb and said nothing, which felt like the right thing. They reached Mercy Refuge Home for Widows an hour later. It was a clean white building set back from the road behind a low picket fence. The paint was fresh, the windows were trimmed in dark wood, and the front walk was swept bare. At first glance, it looked like a decent place, like somewhere a person might actually want to be. But the side gates were locked with heavy iron bolts, and the women visible in the windows were not watching the morning with curiosity or ease. They sat still and straight, looking out without expression, the way people look when they have stopped expecting anything good to come through the door. Caleb tied off the wagon. He carried Grace, and Miriam and Amos came up the front walk behind him. The woman who answered his knock was matron Eudora Clasp. She was neat from collar to hem, with pale eyes and a manner so composed it felt practiced. She looked at the 4 of them the way a person looks at something they already know how to handle. She did not know any Anna Whitcomb, she said. All women in her care were present, either by charitable arrangement or by court order. She smiled when she said it. The smile did not reach her eyes. Caleb looked past her into the hallway. Clean floors, closed doors, a staircase rising to a dim upper landing. Then Grace began to cry. It was a hungry cry, sharp and rising. The sound filled the front hall and went up the staircase like it was looking for something. From somewhere above them, a sound came back down. It was not a word. It was not calm. It was the sound a woman makes when her body responds before her mind can stop it. Raw and broken and immediate. Caleb was already moving. Matron Clasp stepped forward, but he went past her without slowing. Up the stairs, down the narrow hall, to the door at the end where the sound had come from. He knocked once. Then he tried the handle. Locked. "Ma'am," he said through the wood. "Ma'am, I have the baby." Silence. Then a sharp breath. Then, barely above a whisper from the other side of the door. "I knew," she cried. "I knew it." Caleb looked back at Amos, who had followed him up the stairs and now stood in the hallway with his hand resting on the wall for balance. Miriam was a step behind, her face tight and still. A key turned in the lock from the outside. Miriam had taken it from the matron's ring downstairs without asking. The door swung open. A pale young woman stood in the middle of a small bare room. She was thin. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on Grace with an expression that held 3 weeks of grief and terror and desperate hope all at once. She looked at the baby. Then she looked at Caleb. "She's alive," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "They told me she was gone before morning." Her voice broke on the last word. "They told me grief made me imagine the crying." She reached out with both hands, trembling. Caleb stepped forward and placed Grace into her arms. The woman pulled the baby to her chest and bent over her, shaking. She did not make a sound for a long moment. She just held her. Then she looked up at Caleb with wet eyes and said, "My name is Anna Whitcomb." Anna's legs gave out. Caleb caught her by the elbow before she went down, steadying her the way he would steady a colt that had spooked. She was lighter than he expected. Her whole body was trembling, and she clutched Grace so tightly that for a moment he was afraid she might hurt the baby. But Grace did not cry. She went quiet against Anna's chest, like she recognized something she had been missing. Miriam stepped inside the room and closed the door behind her. Then she turned and opened it again, because Matron Clasp was right there in the hall. The matron had followed them up. She stood in the doorframe with her hands clasped at her waist, her composure still intact, but beginning to show cracks around the edges. Her eyes moved from Anna to Grace to Caleb and back to Anna. "This woman is here under court protection," she said. "Her name is Anna Wells. She was placed in our care because of emotional instability following a loss. I must ask you all to leave." "Her name," Amos said from behind the matron, "is Anna Whitcomb. I performed her marriage to Daniel Whitcomb myself. I know her face." Clasp turned to look at him. Something flickered in her expression. Not guilt exactly, more like recalculation. "Reverend Pike?" she said carefully. "I have no record of that name in this house?" "No," Amos said. "I don't expect you do." Miriam moved to Anna's side and spoke quietly. "Can you tell us what happened? From the beginning." Anna looked up from the baby. Her eyes were red, and her lips were pressed together like she was trying to keep something from falling apart inside her. Then she nodded. She said she had been brought to Mercy Refuge shortly after Daniel died. She had been frightened and alone and far along with child, and someone had told her the refuge was a safe place for women in her situation. When her time came, a woman she did not know delivered the baby. Anna remembered the sound of crying. She remembered holding her daughter for only a moment, just long enough to feel her weight and hear her voice. Then she was given something to drink. She was told it was for the pain. When she woke, the room was quiet. Matron Clasp had come in and sat beside the bed with folded hands. She said the baby had been born too weak. She said it had passed before sunrise and had already been put in the ground, because fever moves fast and sentiment cannot slow it. She said Anna needed rest, and that grief sometimes made women hear things that were not there. Anna had kept telling them she heard her baby cry. They kept telling her she was not well. After a while, she said, she had started to wonder if they were right. Matron Clasp had not moved from the doorway. Her chin was lifted. Her hands were still. She was listening to every word and showing nothing. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He did not speak. There was nothing he trusted himself to say to her just then. He turned back to Anna. She was looking down at Grace with an expression that was so full of pain and relief and wonder, all twisted together, that it was hard to watch. The baby had one tiny fist pressed against Anna's collarbone, and Anna had her cheek resting against the top of Grace's head. "I named her," Anna whispered. "Before she was born, I chose a name. I used to say it to her at night when no one was listening." She looked up at Caleb. "I called her Mercy." Caleb held that name for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I called her Grace. I didn't know what else to call her when I found her." Anna looked at him. Something soft moved across her face. She looked back down at the baby and pressed her lips to the child's forehead. "Mercy Grace Whitcomb," she said. Amos stepped forward then. His voice was low and deliberate. "That name may matter more than you know," he said. "Birth records, baptism entries, inheritance filings. A child's full name is how the law knows who she is and what she is owed." "Then we cannot stay here another minute," Miriam said. She was already looking at the door. Matron Clasp blocked the doorway. She was not a large woman, but she filled the frame with the kind of authority that comes from years of being obeyed without question. Her eyes settled on Anna first, then moved to Caleb. "This woman is under court protection," she said again. "If you remove her from this house, I will report you for abducting a ward of the court, every one of you." Amos stepped forward on his uneven gait and stood directly in front of her. He was shorter than Caleb and older than anyone in the room, but he did not blink. Anna Whitcomb is leaving of her own free will, he said. She is leaving in the company of a schoolteacher, a minister of the gospel, and a man of property. If you report this to anyone, you will also have to explain why a living woman was kept locked upstairs under a false name. Clasp's mouth tightened. Amos did not move. She stepped aside. Caleb kept his right hand loose at his side as they walked down the hall and through the front door. He did not reach for the revolver. He wanted to. But he knew exactly what Bellamy would do with that story. A grieving rancher drawing iron on a church matron would become the headline that buried everything else. Anna carried Grace herself. Her arms shook with the effort, but she did not ask for help. She held the baby against her collarbone and walked down the porch steps and out to the wagon with her eyes straight ahead. The gates opened. They moved through. Nobody followed. The road back stretched long and quiet. The dust from the morning had settled. The sky was pale and wide. Anna sat in the wagon bed with her back against the side rail, Grace tucked against her chest. For a long while she only looked at the baby. Her fingers moved slowly across the child's cheek, her ear, her tiny knuckles, learning the shape of her. After a while she spoke. "Where did you find her?" Caleb told her. He kept his eyes on the road while he talked. He described the storm, the calf that bolted, the broken wagon half buried in dust near the dry creek bed. He told her about the flour sack and the thin crying he had almost mistaken for wind. She was cold, he said, but she was strong. She was fighting. Anna was quiet for a moment. "The note," she said. "Who wrote it?" "I don't know," Caleb said. The handwriting was shaky. Could have been anyone who knew enough to be afraid. Anna looked down at Grace. "Someone knew she was alive," she said softly. "Someone put her in that road instead of letting her disappear." Caleb nodded. He had thought about that more than once. Amos spoke from the bench beside Caleb. "The Lord makes use of frightened hands, same as brave ones." Nobody argued with that. They reached the ranch by mid-afternoon. Anna stepped down from the wagon slowly, still holding Grace, and followed Caleb into the house. She stopped just inside the kitchen doorway. Her eyes moved to the cradle in the corner, to Mary's quilt folded over the side, to the small cloths stacked neatly on the shelf, the tin of salve, the little feeding spoon Miriam had bought. She stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then she pressed her free hand over her mouth, and her shoulders came up around her ears, the way a person's do when they are trying very hard not to fall apart in front of strangers. "You took care of her," she whispered. Caleb looked at the floor. "Best I could." "No." Anna shook her head and looked at him with wet eyes. "You took care of her." Caleb had no answer for that. He just nodded once and stepped back to give her room. Miriam moved to the stove without being asked and began building up the fire for soup. Amos settled at the kitchen table, drew out a small journal and a stub of pencil, and asked Anna gently if she was ready to tell her story from the start. She sat down with Grace still in her arms and said yes. The house filled up, not loudly. It filled the way a room does when people are working together toward something that matters. The smell of soup rose from the stove. Amos's pencil scratched across paper. Anna's voice came low and steady, and Miriam listened while she stirred. Caleb stayed through most of it. Then, after a while, he moved to the door. He stepped out onto the porch and stood in the cooling air. Through the window behind him, he could see the soft glow of the lamp. He could hear Anna's voice inside, quieter now, talking to Grace rather than to Amos. Just a mother and her child, trading sounds in the lamplight. Caleb put one hand on the porch rail and stood very still. He had not heard his house sound like that in 3 years. He stood there a long time, listening. Tessa Cobb arrived just before dark. She came on foot, which told Caleb something. A woman who did not want her horse seen outside a certain gate came on foot. She knocked twice, soft and quick, and when Caleb opened the door, she stepped inside fast and pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, as if the night air itself might carry word back to Bellamy. She stopped when she saw Anna. Anna looked back at her from the kitchen table, Grace asleep in her arms. Tessa pressed a hand to her chest. "She is real," she said quietly. I wondered. I hoped. Anna gave her a tired smile. "She is real." Tessa sat down and did not speak again for a moment. Then she straightened her back and folded her hands on the table and said, "All right, tell me what we have." Caleb spread everything out on the kitchen table, the warning note first. He unfolded it carefully and set it flat in the center where everyone could see. The handwriting was cramped and uneven. The letters pressed hard into the paper, like whoever wrote it had been shaking. "Do not let Judge Bellamy know she lived." Someone knew, Miriam said, not for the first time. Someone inside that system knew exactly what was happening. Next came the flour sack. Caleb laid it beside the note. The stamp was faded, but still readable. Willow Creek Mill, WCM. 3 letters that connected a baby left in a dust storm to a piece of land worth more than most men in Mercy Bend would ever see. Tessa reached out and touched the edge of the sack without picking it up. "I remember that lot," she said. "I packed those sacks myself that week." Then came the charity receipt. Miriam placed it on the table with the careful hands of a woman who understood that paper could be as powerful as a pistol when used in the right room. The signature of Matron Eudora Clasp sat at the bottom, neat and practiced. "Too neat," Miriam said. "I have seen court handwriting for 20 years. That signature did not belong to a matron filling out a charity form. That belonged to someone who had been told what to write." Amos nodded slowly from his end of the table. He had his journal open in front of him, the one he had been writing in while Anna talked. "I performed the marriage of Anna Whitcomb and Daniel Whitcomb myself," he said. "I have the entry. Date, names, witnesses. It is in my circuit ledger, which I keep at the church." He tapped the journal. "And Anna's testimony matches every detail of what I recorded when Daniel died and left her with the homestead and a child on the way." Anna sat quietly through all of it. Grace stirred once in her arms, and she rocked her without thinking, the way mothers do when it becomes something the body knows without being told. Miriam spoke next. "Bellamy filed the tax claim on Willow Spring 11 days after the supposed infant death record was entered," she said. 11 days. A grieving widow had not even had time to bury her grief, and already the paperwork was moving. She paused. That does not happen by accident. The table went still for a moment. Then Tessa let out a slow breath and looked at her own folded hands. "He holds my husband's debt," she said. Her voice was steady, but her fingers pressed white against each other. "If I speak against him, he could call that note due inside a week. I could lose the mill." She lifted her eyes. "I know that. I want you all to know that I know that." Nobody rushed her. She swallowed. "But I will testify. What was done to this woman and this child is not something I can look past. I cannot." Amos set down his pencil. "The circuit magistrate rides into Mercy Bend in 5 days," he said. "His authority sits above any local bench, including Bellamy's. If we can keep Anna and Grace safe until that court convenes, we have a real chance." Every head at the table turned toward Caleb. He did not hesitate. "They stay here," he said. "Both of them. I will not leave this property unmanned." Anna looked at him across the table. The lamp threw soft light across her face and across the baby sleeping against her. She looked tired and young, and something else underneath all of it. Something that had been knocked flat and was slowly finding its feet again. "I will stand in that courtroom," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "Whatever he puts in front of me, I will stand there. My daughter is not going to spend her life hiding from the man who tried to erase her." Anna woke to darkness and did not know where she was. She sat up fast, heart slamming, and reached blindly beside her. Then she heard it, the small, even breath of her daughter sleeping inches away. She pressed her hand against Grace's back and felt the rise and fall. Steady. Real. There. Anna closed her eyes and breathed out slow. She sat like that for a long moment in the gray light of early morning, one hand resting on the baby, letting the panic drain away. It had been 15 days of waking to nothing, 15 days of reaching and finding empty air. She had told herself she was dreaming when she heard crying through the walls of Mercy Refuge. The matron had told her she was dreaming. She was not dreaming now. Outside, she heard the distant sound of a bucket handle knocking against a post, then boots on dry earth. She moved to the small window and looked out. Caleb was already in the yard. He moved through the early chores the way a man does when he is trying not to make noise, lifting and setting things down carefully, working the pump handle slowly so it would not squeak. He did not know she was watching. His shoulders were broad under his worn coat, and his breath made small clouds in the cold morning air. Anna watched him a moment longer. Then she wrapped Grace snug and held her close and went to find the kitchen. Miriam arrived before the coffee had finished. She knocked once, came straight in, and set a cloth-wrapped bundle on the table without ceremony. More soft cloth, a small jar of salve, a paper packet of dried chamomile. "How is she?" Miriam asked, looking at Grace. "Better than yesterday," Anna said. "And yesterday was better than the day before." Miriam gave a short nod, which from her was the same as a wide smile from someone else. A neighbor boy knocked at the door an hour later with a basket from Tessa. Inside was a round loaf of bread, a jar of goat's milk still warm from the morning, and a small folded note. Anna read it and held it against her chest for a moment without explaining what it said. Caleb came in from outside, stomping mud from his boots, and stopped when he saw the basket. He looked at Anna. "Tessa," she said. He nodded and said nothing else, but something in his face softened. Through the morning, Grace moved between them naturally. Anna fed her, and Grace's small face worked with serious concentration the way babies do, as if eating were the most important work in the world. Caleb sat nearby, sharpening a bridle buckle and watching without meaning to. When Anna shifted Grace to her shoulder to burp her, the baby squirmed and turned her head, and somehow ended up facing Caleb's direction. Grace looked at him with the wide, unfocused gaze of a very young baby and made a sound low in her throat. Not a cry. Something else. Something almost like recognition. Caleb set down the buckle. He reached out one rough finger, and Grace's hand closed around it immediately. The same way she had in the dust storm. The same grip that had kept him from riding toward town that first night. Anna watched this and said nothing, but her eyes were soft. Supper was plain and warm and good. Cornbread, salt pork, a pot of beans Caleb had left on the stove all afternoon. Miriam had gone home by then to feed her own fire. It was just the three of them around the table, with Grace asleep in the cradle nearby. Anna told him about Daniel. She said he was not a complicated man, which she meant as the highest praise. He had worked hard. He had laughed easily. He had spent 2 summers digging and laying stone around the spring on the homestead because he wanted it right. He told her the water that came up from that ground was not just land. It was their daughter's future before they even knew they were going to have a daughter. "He knew?" Caleb asked. "He hoped," Anna said. "He said the spring deserved a girl's name someday." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, the way a man handles something he has not picked up in a long time, he told her about Mary. He did not say much. He said she was warm, and she sang while she cooked, and she had picked out a name for their baby that he still could not say out loud. He said he built the nursery in the spring, and she died before the leaves turned, and he had not opened that door for 3 years, until Grace needed the cradle. His voice stayed even throughout, but his jaw worked once at the end, the way it does when a man is holding something still by force. Anna did not fill the silence with quick words. She let it sit for a moment, the way silence deserves to sit sometimes. Then she said, "Grief like that does not hollow a person out, Caleb. I know it feels that way." She looked at Grace, sleeping in the cradle he had built with his own hands. "But I think it made room. Room for something you did not know was coming." Caleb looked at the baby too. He did not answer, but he did not look away either. Outside in the darkness, beyond the yellow glow of the windows, Silas Drum stood at the tree line with his collar turned up and his eyes fixed on the lit glass, watching the shape of the three of them, the way a man watches something he has been told to destroy. The rooster had not yet crowed when Caleb heard horses on the road. He was already awake. He had been awake for an hour, sitting in the chair beside the cold fireplace, turning the situation over in his mind the way a man turns a stone he knows has something ugly underneath. The circuit magistrate was still 5 days out. 5 days was a long time when a man like Bellamy was moving. He heard the hooves slow at the gate, more than one horse. Caleb stood, pulled on his boots, and crossed to the window without lighting a lamp. 3 riders. Silas Drum in front, sitting easy in the saddle the way cruel men do when they feel protected. 2 others behind him with rifles resting across their thighs, not aimed but present. The kind of message that did not need words. Caleb took his coat from the peg and went out the front door before anyone inside could stir. He stood on the porch with his arms loose at his sides and waited. Silas pulled up at the bottom of the steps and looked down at him with the flat eyes of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped meaning anything. "Got something for you, Rusk." He held out a folded paper with a court seal pressed into wax at the fold. Caleb walked down the steps and took it without a word. He opened it and read slowly. The language was formal and cold. It ordered one Caleb Rusk to appear before Judge Elias Bellamy that afternoon at 2 o'clock regarding unlawful concealment of an abandoned infant and interference with a court-supervised widow currently under protective guardianship. Caleb kept his face still. "The judge already knows the widow is here," Silas said, with something close to pleasure at the edges of his mouth. "Just so you don't waste time thinking you can tidy things up before you come in." Caleb folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket. 2 o'clock, he said. Silas held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode back down the road without hurrying, which was its own kind of threat. Miriam arrived within the hour. Caleb suspected someone in town had sent word to her, because she came with her coat buttoned to the throat and her expression set like mortar. She read the summons at the kitchen table, while Anna held Grace close by the window, her back straight and her eyes watching Miriam's face. "You have to go," Miriam said. She set the paper flat on the table with her palm. "If you refuse, Bellamy tells the magistrate you fled. If you go in angry, he tells the magistrate you are unstable." She looked at Caleb directly. "He wants you to do something wrong. Do not give him the gift." Caleb looked at Anna. Anna gave a small nod that cost her something. "I will go," he said. Bellamy's courtroom smelled of polished wood and authority. Every bench was filled. Caleb had not expected that. Someone had made sure the town would be watching. Bellamy sat behind the high bench in a dark coat, clean-shaved, his silver hair neat. He looked less like a villain than like someone's respected grandfather. That was the most dangerous thing about him. He let Caleb stand before the room for a long moment before he spoke. Then he laid out his accusations in the calm, measured tone of a man who had rehearsed them until they sounded like simple fact. Caleb had taken an abandoned infant without reporting it to the court. Caleb had located a court-supervised widow in a state of mental fragility and removed her from her place of care. It was the opinion of this court, Bellamy said, that Caleb Rusk had done these things, not out of compassion, but out of a calculated interest in the Willow Spring homestead, which the widow stood to inherit. The word calculated landed hard in the room. Caleb felt the heat rise up the back of his neck. He took one step forward. Miriam's hand closed around his forearm. Firm, steady. She did not look at him, but her grip said everything. He stopped. Bellamy then produced 2 documents. He held the first one up so the room could see the court seal. An infant death certificate, he said, filed 15 days ago, signed and sealed by this court. Anna Whitcomb's baby died the night of its birth. He set it down and lifted the second. A guardianship order, also court-stamped, declaring Anna Whitcomb of unsound mind following the trauma of childbirth and the loss of her child. She was placed under protective care for her own safety. He looked out at the crowded benches with an expression that managed to appear sorrowful. The child this man is carrying about town, Bellamy said, has no legal identity, and the woman he has taken from her place of care has no legal standing to make decisions about her own welfare. He folded his hands. I will be seeking temporary custody of the infant when the circuit magistrate arrives. Until that hearing, I am calling on the good people of this town to consider carefully what kind of man removes a grieving widow from supervised care and claims a nameless baby as his own. The room was quiet. Then it wasn't. The whispers started low, passed from bench to bench, moving through the crowd the way a fire moves through dry grass. Caleb heard pieces of it, heard his own name spoken in a way it had never been spoken before. He walked out of the courtroom with Anna beside him, and Grace held tight against Anna's chest. People who had brought soup to his door last week watched him pass without meeting his eyes. The ride home was quiet in the worst way. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that sits on a man's chest and presses down. Caleb kept his eyes on the road and his jaw tight. Anna sat beside him on the wagon bench with Grace held close, not speaking. Miriam followed behind on her horse. Nobody had anything to say that would fix what had just happened in that courtroom. When they reached the ranch, Caleb unhitched the horse without a word and led it to the barn. He stood in the dim stall for longer than the task required. His hands rested on the horse's flank, and he breathed slowly and tried to let the anger out before he brought it inside where Anna and Grace were. It did not work very well. He went inside anyway. Anna was sitting at the kitchen table with Grace against her shoulder. Her face was pale and tight. She looked up when Caleb came in, and something in her expression told him she had been holding herself together the whole ride home and was still doing it. Barely. They believed him, she said. Not angry, just quiet and afraid. They looked at that paper with his seal on it, and they believed him. Caleb set his hat on the peg. Not all of them. Enough of them. He did not argue, because she was right. Miriam came in behind him and settled at the table across from Anna. She poured water into a cup and pushed it toward Anna without being asked. Then she folded her hands and looked at both of them. The death record is the problem, she said. It is stamped. It is dated. It looks official. She paused. Anyone can say they were wronged after the fact. Bellamy knows that. He will tell the magistrate that Anna only started remembering things differently once Caleb put ideas in her head. Anna flinched. What he cannot explain away, Miriam continued, is fear that existed before any of this. Before the birth, before the death record, before Caleb ever found that baby in the road. She looked at Caleb steadily. If we can show Anna was afraid of Bellamy months ago, when she had no reason to invent accusations, that is a different story entirely. Caleb thought about that. How do we prove what she felt months ago? Letters, Miriam said simply. A diary. Anything written down before Bellamy had a reason to silence her? Anna shook her head slowly. I had no one to write to. My mother was gone. Daniel was gone. She paused and something crossed her face. A memory, soft and sad. I wrote to Mary. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb did not move. Mary Rusk, Anna said quietly, looking at him. She was kind to me after Daniel passed. She left bread at my door twice when I had nothing. I wrote her a letter to thank her. Maybe 2 letters. She hesitated. I do not know if she kept them. Caleb thought of Mary's sewing basket. He had not opened it since the week after the funeral. It sat on the shelf in the nursery, where she had always kept it, because he could not bring himself to touch it, and he could not bring himself to move it. He pushed back from the table. I know where to look, he said. The nursery was dim. He lit the small lamp on the windowsill and stood still for a moment, the way a man stands before he does something that will cost him. Mary's sewing basket was on the middle shelf, exactly where it had always been. Woven brown reeds, a faded blue ribbon tied around the handle. He had walked past it 100 times without touching it. He lifted it down. It was lighter than he remembered. Inside were spools of thread, a small pair of scissors, a thimble, and beneath a folded square of muslin, a neat packet of letters tied with kitchen string. Caleb sat down on the edge of the cradle and untied the string with careful fingers. There were 7 letters. He went through them slowly, reading each one by the lamplight. The 4th one stopped him. The handwriting was unsteady, like someone writing through exhaustion or grief. The date at the top was almost 8 months earlier, weeks before winter had set in, months before Grace was born. It began, Dear Mary, the first am writing to thank you again for the bread and for not asking me to explain myself. There are not many people left who are kind without wanting something back. Caleb read on. Anna wrote about the cold, about missing Daniel, about the baby growing and how she talked to it at night because there was no one else to talk to. Then, near the bottom of the page, Judge Bellamy came to the property again last week. He said it was a courtesy visit, but he asked about the water rights to the spring and whether I understood the tax record. He said a widow alone with a baby coming could not be expected to manage land that complicated. He was very polite about it. That is what frightened me most. I do not know what to do, Mary. The first do not know who to tell. Caleb read that part twice. He sat still for a long moment with the letter in both hands. Then he stood, walked out the back of the house, and went into the barn. He stood in the dark between the stalls with his back against the wooden post and pressed the letter to his chest and let himself fall apart in the way he never had when people could see him. Because Mary had known. Mary had read this letter. Mary had known Anna was frightened, had known Bellamy was circling that land, and had kept this letter tucked safe in her sewing basket, the way she kept everything that mattered. And then Mary died, and the basket stayed on the shelf. And Caleb never opened it, and Anna was left alone with no one to help her. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and breathed. After a while, the shaking in his chest slowed. He folded the letter carefully and held it at his side. He thought about Mary, her voice, the way she had always seen trouble coming before he did, and known what to do about it. She had been trying to help Anna even then, even from that small, quiet ranch house in the middle of nowhere. She had kept the proof. Caleb wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked up at the barn roof as if she might hear him. "All right," he said softly. "I see it." He walked back across the yard and through the kitchen door. Anna and Miriam looked up at him from the table. He set the letter down in the lamplight in front of Miriam without explaining it. Miriam picked it up and read. When she finished, she looked at Anna. Anna's hand came up slowly to cover her mouth. "I wrote that," she whispered. "I wrote that to Mary." "The first no," Caleb said. His voice was steady now, not because the grief was gone, but because it had found somewhere useful to go. And she kept it. The morning came in gray and still. Caleb was already on the porch when Miriam arrived before sunrise, her coat buttoned to the chin and a leather satchel over her arm. She looked like a woman with a list in her head and no patience for detours. "You stay here," she said to Caleb without preamble. "Keep Anna and Grace inside. Keep the curtains drawn on the roadside." "I was not planning to throw a party," Caleb said. Miriam gave him a look that said she was not in the mood for dry humor. "Amos is meeting me at the church. Tessa is pulling her delivery records this morning before the mill opens." She shifted the satchel on her shoulder. "We have 4 days before the magistrate arrives. That is not much time to build something solid enough to stand against a judge with a seal and a forged certificate." "What do you need from me?" "Your patience," she said, "and your temper locked up tight." She left before he could respond. Inside the house, Anna was awake. She sat in the chair by the cradle with Grace asleep against her shoulder, one hand moving in slow circles on the baby's back. She looked up when Caleb came in. "She slept 4 hours," Anna said quietly. There was quiet wonder in it, like 4 unbroken hours of sleep was something she had stopped believing was possible. "Good," Caleb said. He set water to heat on the stove and moved carefully so as not to make noise. The house had learned a new rhythm in the last few days. Soft footsteps, low voices. A kind of careful tenderness that Caleb had forgotten was possible inside 4 walls. He stayed close all morning. He checked the road twice an hour. He kept his rifle near the door without making it obvious. He watched the tree line the way a man watches weather he does not fully trust yet. Miriam spent the morning on foot in Mercy Bend. She did not make announcements. She did not knock on doors in a way that drew attention. She moved the way a schoolteacher moves through a town she has known for years, stopping to speak with women at the well, at the dry goods porch, at the back doors of homes where she knew the families. She spoke with the woman who washed linens for Mercy Refuge and who had noticed medicine deliveries arriving in plain crates with no labels. She spoke with a midwife's assistant who had been turned away from the refuge the night Anna gave birth, told the mother had everything she needed, which had struck the woman as wrong even then. 2 of the women she approached went pale and said nothing. 1 closed her door, but 3 said yes. 3 quiet, frightened women who had carried the weight of what they had seen for months. They said yes in low voices, with their hands twisting in their aprons, but they said it. Amos worked the other side of town. He visited 2 old church members who had attended Anna and Daniel Whitcomb's wedding years earlier. Both were elderly. Both remembered the day clearly, the way people remember the last good thing before hard times arrived. One of them, a woman named Clara Pitts, still had a pressed flower from that Sunday in her Bible. "I would say so in court," Clara told Amos. "I am old enough that Bellamy does not scare me the way he used to." Amos patted her hand and wrote her name down carefully. Tessa spent the morning in her mill office with the door shut, going through ledger pages with shaking hands. She found what she was looking for near the bottom of a delivery record from weeks before Grace's birth. An order of flour and a separate notation for a crate of brown glass bottles delivered to Mercy Refuge. The same week Anna would have been near her time, she copied the entry twice. She folded both copies and put them in separate pockets. They came back to the ranch near dusk, one by one. Miriam set her satchel on the kitchen table and pressed her palms flat on the wood. 3 witnesses willing to speak, 2 more who might come around if they see others standing first. Tessa laid her copied records beside the satchel. The medicine delivery is there. Same week, same destination. She paused. Bellamy will say it means nothing. It means something when it sits beside everything else, Miriam said. Amos lowered himself into a chair by the stove with the slow care of a man whose joints had earned their complaints. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at Caleb. I have something that may matter more than any of it, he said. I kept a traveling circuit ledger. Every marriage, birth, baptism, and burial I recorded while riding this valley. Anna's marriage to Daniel Whitcomb is in there. The pregnancy record I made when she asked me to pray over the child before birth. All of it. He folded his hands. It is in an old trunk beneath the church schoolroom floor. I need to go back for it in the morning. The room was very quiet. Anna looked at Amos from across the table. Her voice was barely above a whisper. That ledger could prove who Grace is. Yes, Amos said simply. It could. Caleb looked at the faces around his kitchen table. 3 frightened witnesses, delivery records, a circuit ledger not yet in hand, 4 days. It was not much, but it was more than they had yesterday. Miriam bowed her head without being asked, and one by one the others followed. Amos prayed in a plain and honest voice, the way he had prayed over dusty roads and hard weather his whole life. He asked for courage. He asked for clear minds. He asked that truth would find a way to stand even when powerful men tried to bury it. When he finished, the room held the kind of silence that feels like an answer. Across town, the courthouse was dark, except for one lamp burning in the back office. Bellamy sat behind his desk, his coat still on, his hands folded with the patience of a man who planned several moves ahead. Silas Drum stood across from him, hat in hand, his hard face unreadable. Bellamy spoke quietly. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. There are records being gathered, he said. Old ones. I want to make sure they do not reach the magistrate's table. Silas said nothing. He simply nodded once. Bellamy looked back down at his desk as if the conversation had already ended. The morning came in pale and still. Caleb was up before the sun touched the ridge. He stood on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the road the way he had watched it every morning since Bellamy's visit. Nothing moved out there, just dry grass bending in a thin wind and the long, empty quiet of a valley that held its breath. Inside, he could hear Anna moving softly. Grace had woken twice in the night, and Anna had handled both times without calling for him. He had lain still on his cot and listened to her low murmuring voice settle the baby back to sleep. There was something in that sound that made the dark feel less heavy. Miriam arrived at first light with Amos riding beside her on his old mule. They stopped at the porch long enough to collect a biscuit each and exchange a few words. We will be back before midday, Miriam said. She had her satchel and a flat wooden box tucked under one arm for carrying documents. Amos adjusted himself on the mule with the patience of a man who had ridden harder roads than this. The trunk is beneath a loose board in the back corner of the schoolroom. I put it there 12 years ago and never had reason to move it. You sure it is still there? Caleb asked. Amos looked at him mildly. I am sure I put it there. I am also sure I am the only person who knew it existed. He clicked his tongue at the mule and started down the road. Caleb watched them go. Then he picked up his hammer and went to work on the loose shutter along the east wall of the house. It had been banging in the wind for 2 nights, and he had kept meaning to fix it. Now the noise of it felt like something he could not afford to ignore. He drove the nails in slow and steady, one eye always drifting back toward the road. Anna appeared in the doorway behind him, with Grace against her shoulder. "You have checked that road 6 times since they left," she said. Caleb tapped another nail. 7. She stepped out onto the porch and stood in the morning light. Grace made a small sound and settled her head more firmly against Anna's neck. "I am not going to run," Anna said. It was not a boast. It was just a fact, stated the way she might say the sky was clear. "I want you to know that. Whatever Bellamy tries, I am not leaving without seeing this through." Caleb looked at her. She was pale and still thinner than she should have been, but her eyes were steady. "I know," he said, and he did. At the church schoolroom, Amos went straight to the back corner without hesitation. He pressed down on a particular floorboard with the toe of his boot, and it shifted. Miriam helped him lift it aside. Below it sat a battered trunk, wrapped in an old piece of oilcloth that had kept the damp out for more than a decade. Amos opened it on the schoolroom floor and moved through it with quiet care. He found the traveling ledger near the bottom, its leather cover dark with age, but the pages inside clean and dry. He also found 3 folded letters and a hand-drawn family record sheet he had made for the Whitcomb family at Sarah Whitcomb's request, naming Anna as Daniel's lawful wife and listing her place in the family line. He held the ledger and the papers up. "Here," he said simply. Miriam examined each page with the sharp attention she gave to everything. She confirmed the entries, confirmed the signatures, confirmed the dates. "This is enough," she said quietly. "This is more than enough." They packed everything into the flat wooden box and loaded it onto the mule. They were halfway back down the ridge road when the rifle shot cracked through the morning air. The bullet struck the dirt 6 feet ahead of the mule. The animal lurched sideways. Amos held the reins firm and kept his seat. Miriam grabbed the box and pressed herself low. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Amos straightened on the mule. His jaw was set. "Keep moving," he said. Caleb heard the shot from the ranch. He was already on his horse before the echo finished rolling across the valley. He met them on the road a quarter-mile from the house, rifle across his lap, scanning the ridge as he rode. He found them unhurt, the mule still nervous but moving, the wooden box held tight in Miriam's hands. "You see where it came from?" Caleb asked. "The ridge above the second bend," Miriam said. "One shot, high enough to warn, not to kill." "Not yet," Caleb said. Amos looked at him with steady eyes. "Wicked men always count on the righteous growing tired," he said. "That is their whole plan. They fire a shot, and they wait for the other side to lose its nerve." He glanced toward the box in Miriam's arms. "We will not lose ours." That evening, they gathered again at the kitchen table. Amos laid the original ledger before them. They turned the pages slowly and confirmed every entry. Anna's name was there. Daniel's name was there. The marriage date. The pregnancy blessing. The Whitcomb family record. It was all real. All of it. They agreed on a plan. Miriam would carry carefully made copies of the delivery records, the letters, and the family sheet to her schoolhouse for safekeeping. Multiple copies in separate locations. If Bellamy's men came for one, they would not find all of it. The original ledger would stay with Amos. "No one thinks twice about an old preacher with a prayer book," Amos said. Miriam looked at him. "The ledger does not look like a prayer book." "No," Amos agreed, "but the trunk it travels in does." Caleb set his hands flat on the table and looked at the ledger one more time. 3 days until the magistrate arrived. They had what they needed. Now they had to keep it alive long enough to use it. The morning of the hearing came in gray and close. Caleb brought the wagon around before the sun had fully cleared the hills. He moved quietly, checking the wheels, checking the harness, doing the small things that kept his hands busy and his mind from running ahead of itself. Anna came out of the house on her own. She had pinned her hair back and worn the cleanest dress Miriam had brought for her. She looked steady, not unafraid, but steady. There is a difference between those two things, and Caleb had learned to tell them apart. He offered her his hand to help her up into the wagon. She took it without hesitation. Miriam followed with Grace, wrapped snug against her chest. Amos came last, moving slowly on his bad leg, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle under one arm that looked like nothing more than an old preacher's book. He climbed up without complaint. Caleb took the reins and turned them toward Mercy Bend. Nobody said much on the ride in. The road was dry, and the wagon wheels raised a thin trail of dust behind them. Grace slept. The courtroom was already filling when they arrived. Caleb tied the horse out front and helped Anna down. He could feel the town watching. People stood in clusters on the boardwalk and near the door, speaking low to one another. Some faces were sympathetic. Some were cautious. Some looked at Caleb the way people look at a man they are not quite sure about anymore. Bellamy had done that. He had planted the seed of doubt and let the town water it with its own fear. Inside, the room smelled of sawdust and lamp oil. The benches filled quickly. Bellamy sat at the front behind his polished desk, calm and arranged, his coat pressed, his hands folded. He looked like a man attending a church service, rather than a man trying to crush two women and a baby. Caleb sat beside Anna in the front. Miriam took the seat beside him with Grace still sleeping. Amos settled on the end of the bench and rested the cloth-wrapped ledger across his knees. Bellamy opened the proceedings the way he opened everything, smoothly, politely, like a man doing everyone a favor. He reviewed the facts as he called them. An abandoned infant, a grieving widower who had taken it upon himself to make decisions that belonged to the court, a woman of uncertain mental stability who had been properly cared for at Mercy Refuge and was now making accusations she could not support. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. Anna was called to speak. She rose slowly and faced the room. Her voice shook at first, but only at first. She said she remembered giving birth. She said she remembered her daughter crying. That first, thin, urgent cry that every mother knows belongs to her child alone. She said she was given something to drink that she did not ask for and did not want. She said when she woke, Matron Clasp told her the baby was already buried. I was not imagining the cry, Anna said clearly. I was not confused by grief. I heard my daughter, and then someone took her from me and told me she was dead. The courtroom was very quiet. Then Bellamy spoke. He was gentle about it, which made it worse. He tilted his head with something that looked like sympathy and asked Anna whether grief had perhaps made certain memories feel more certain than they truly were. He asked whether she had been sleeping well before the birth, whether she had been eating properly, whether the loss of her husband Daniel had left her in a fragile state of mind. He did not call her a liar. He simply arranged his words so that everyone in the room might wonder whether she knew the difference between what she remembered and what she wished had happened. Anna held her chin up and answered every question with the same quiet firmness, but Caleb could see the strain in her shoulders. He gripped the edge of the bench. Miriam reached over without looking at him and pressed her hand over his. A firm, steady pressure that said, "Not yet." Then Bellamy turned toward Caleb. He spoke about grief in a tone that managed to sound both sorrowful and faintly contemptuous. He spoke about men who had suffered great losses and how that suffering, if left unaddressed, could lead a man toward desperate substitutions. He did not say Caleb was a desperate and lonely widower who had stolen a baby to fill the hole his dead wife had left behind. He came close enough that several people in the room would hear it that way. Caleb stood up. Miriam's hand tightened hard on his arm. He sat back down. Barely. When Amos moved to rise and introduce the ledger, Bellamy raised one hand with practiced calm. "Reverend Pike," he said pleasantly, "I have the deepest respect for your years of service, but in the interest of proper procedure, I believe physical evidence of that nature ought to be presented before the circuit magistrate directly. It would not do to conduct a full evidentiary review at a preliminary proceeding. Surely you agree that the law deserves its proper order? Amos looked at him for a long moment. Of course, Amos said mildly, and sat down. Bellamy adjourned the hearing with a gracious smile and a reminder that the circuit magistrate would arrive in 2 days and that all matters would be resolved properly at that time. People filed out. Some glanced at Caleb, some did not. Caleb stood in the emptying room and watched Bellamy gather his papers without hurry. Something turned over cold in his chest. Bellamy had not challenged the ledger. He had not tried to discredit it or argue against it. He had simply made sure it would not be seen today. 2 days. Bellamy needed 2 days. Caleb looked at Amos, who was tucking the cloth-wrapped ledger carefully back under his arm. The delay was not about proper order. Bellamy was planning to make sure that ledger never reached the magistrate at all. The ride home was quiet in a way that pressed down on all of them. Nobody argued about the hearing or picked apart what Bellamy had said. There was nothing left to pick apart. Everyone in that wagon understood what had happened. Bellamy had smiled and stalled and bought himself time, and they had sat there and let him do it, because there was no other choice that did not hand him something worse. Caleb kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut. Back at the ranch, Anna fed Grace by the window while the last of the daylight drained out of the sky. Amos sat near the hearth with the ledger in his lap, not reading it, just keeping it close the way a man keeps a hand near something valuable without being obvious about it. Miriam moved around the kitchen with the controlled energy of someone whose mind was working harder than her hands. After supper, she set down her cup and looked at Tessa. "I want to check the schoolhouse copies before dark," she said. "Make sure everything is ordered the way we need it for the magistrate." Tessa nodded and reached for her coat. Caleb looked up. "You need me to ride with you?" "Stay here," Miriam said, already moving toward the door. "Anna and Grace need someone they trust close by. Tessa and I will be back within the hour." He did not argue. Miriam was not the kind of woman you argued with when her voice carried that particular tone of finality. And she was right. Anna should not be left with only Amos, who was old and lame and could not move fast if trouble found the ranch. So Caleb stayed. Supper dishes were cleared. Amos dozed near the fire. Anna sat on the floor with Grace on a folded blanket, coaxing small sounds from the baby the way mothers do, leaning close and murmuring soft things. Caleb stood on the porch and watched the dark. The smell reached him before he saw it. Smoke. Not cook fire smoke or chimney smoke. The thick, ugly smell of something burning that was not meant to burn. He stepped off the porch and looked toward town. Above the tree line, against the dark sky, a pale orange glow rose and spread. His stomach dropped. He went back inside, fast. "Amos!" The old man was already awake, eyes sharp. He had smelled it too. "I have to go," Caleb said. "You stay here. You keep that door latched, and you do not open it for anyone but me or Miriam." Anna looked up from the floor. Her face had gone white. "Go," she said quietly. "Go fast." Caleb saddled his horse in under 2 minutes and rode hard toward Mercy Bend. The schoolhouse was fully involved by the time he reached it. Flames pushed out of the 2 east windows and chewed along the roof edge. A line of townspeople passed buckets from the trough to the door, but the fire had too much of a head start. They were slowing it, not stopping it. Miriam stood back from the heat with her hands pressed to her face. Then he saw Tessa on the ground near the side door, 2 men kneeling over her. She had a gash above her brow, and her hands were burned red. Beside her on the dirt was a singed wooden box, its lid broken off, papers inside curled black at the edges. Ruined. Caleb scanned the crowd. He saw Silas Drum moving along the backside of the building, away from the fire, away from the bucket line, moving like a man trying not to be seen leaving. Something broke loose inside Caleb that he could not pull back. He crossed the distance in seconds, grabbed Silas by the coat, and drove him into the ground. He hit him twice before Silas could get his arms up. Then again. The rage that came out of him had been building since the note, since the crow on the barn door, since the courtroom that afternoon, since 3 years of grief with nowhere to go. The sheriff dragged him off. Bellamy was already there, watching from the edge of the crowd, calm as a man who had planned the whole evening. "Arrest him," Bellamy said simply. Assault on a deputy, witnessed by a dozen people. The sheriff locked Caleb's wrists behind him and walked him down the street. Caleb looked back at the smoking schoolhouse, at the ruined box, at Tessa's burned hands, and understood with a hollow and sickening certainty that he had just handed Bellamy exactly what the man had been waiting for. The jail cell was small and cold. Smoke drifted past the single high window and turned the night gray. Caleb sat on the floor with his back against the stone wall, dried blood on his knuckles, and believed with everything in him that he had ruined it all. The jail had one window. It sat high in the stone wall, too small for a man to fit through, just wide enough to let in a strip of cold night air and the faint smell of smoke that still drifted over Mercy Bend. Caleb sat on the floor beneath it, with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up, staring at nothing. His knuckles had dried stiff. He flexed his right hand slowly and felt the split skin pull. It hurt. He was glad it hurt. It was the only thing keeping him from going completely numb. He thought about Anna. She would be awake. He knew that without question. She would be sitting in that spare room with Grace pressed against her chest, listening to every sound the darkness made, counting the minutes until Bellamy's carriage came up the road. She had survived being drugged and locked away and told her baby was dead. And now the one man who had stood between her and Bellamy was sitting in a jail cell with blood on his hands because he could not hold his temper for 30 more seconds. He thought about Miriam. She had chosen the schoolhouse because it felt safer than the ranch. She had organized those papers with careful hands, labeled them, ordered them, trusted that walls and a locked door would be enough. It was not her fault. He knew that. But he also knew Miriam would be sitting somewhere right now, telling herself it was. And there was nothing he could do about that either. He thought about Tessa's burned hands. He thought about the wooden box with its curled black papers. He pressed the back of his head against the cold stone and closed his eyes. He had not prayed. Not really. Not since the night they buried Mary, when he had said some words in the direction of heaven, and then decided heaven was not listening. But there was nothing left to do in that cell, no plan to work through, no next move to calculate. He had hit bottom, and the bottom was a stone floor in the dark. So he prayed. Not out loud, not with any kind of shape or order, just the bare truth of what was inside him laid out plain. He told God he was sorry for losing his temper when everything depended on him keeping it. He told God he was sorry he had not found Grace sooner, that she had spent 15 days in the dust and the cold before he stumbled across her. He told God he did not know how to fix what was broken now. He told God he was scared. Then, quieter than the rest of it, he admitted the thing he had not said aloud to anyone. He loved that baby. Not like a duty, not like a man who had done a decent thing and felt good about it. He loved Grace the way he had once imagined loving his own child, with a fierce and helpless tenderness that sat right in the center of his chest and would not move. And he loved Anna too, though that was softer and less formed, like something just beginning to grow that he had not yet named. He sat with all of it in the dark and said nothing more. Outside, somewhere down the alley, a soft knock came against the stone wall. Caleb lifted his head. Another knock, low and deliberate. He stood and looked up at the window. A face appeared in the narrow gap, old, weathered, and covered in dried mud from the collar up. Amos Pike. He was breathing hard, like a man who had been walking fast for a long time. His white hair was damp. His coat was filthy. But his eyes were sharp and steady, the same eyes that had faced down Matron Clasp without flinching. "Boy," Amos said quietly, pressing close to the gap. "Stop looking at me like I'm a ghost." Caleb stepped up onto the cot to get closer to the window. "Where in the world have you been?" "The church," Amos said. He reached into his coat and drew out something wrapped in oilcloth, holding it up so Caleb could see it clearly even in the dark. It was a ledger, old and thick and tied with a cord. "The one that burned," Caleb said. "That was your traveling copy." Amos nodded. "The original has been under the church floor since before Bellamy ever set foot in this valley." He paused to catch his breath. "I dug it out tonight. It has Anna's marriage. It has the Whitcomb family line going back to the land claim." He tapped the cover once. "And there is something else, Caleb. A separate entry. Written by the midwife who attended Anna's birth before Bellamy's people arrived." Caleb gripped the window ledge. "She wrote the baby's full name," Amos said. "Recorded it the same night the child was born, same as custom required." "What name?" Caleb said, though some part of him already knew. Amos looked up at him steadily. "Mercy Grace Whitcomb." The smoke smell was still in the air. The cell was still cold. Caleb's hands still hurt. But something shifted in his chest, like a door swinging open after a very long time. The evidence was not gone. Dawn came slowly to Mercy Bend. The sky lightened from black to gray to a pale, tired blue, and the smoke smell faded some, replaced by cold morning air and the sound of birds that did not care anything about corrupt judges or burned schoolhouses. Caleb stood at the jail window and watched the light change and tried to steady himself. Amos had gone to find Miriam. The ledger was hidden again, tucked back under Amos's coat, safe against his chest. Caleb had told him not to let it out of his hands for any reason. Amos had given him a look that said he was not born yesterday and then disappeared into the early dark. Now Caleb waited. He heard the sheriff before he saw him. Boots on the plank floor outside the cell door, slow and heavy, the walk of a man who was not sure where he was going, but was going there anyway. The door opened and Sheriff Ned Holt stepped in with a tin cup of coffee and set it on the floor inside the bars without a word. Caleb looked at him. Holt was a big man gone soft in the middle, with a gray mustache and tired eyes that had seen too much and done too little about most of it. He stood with his arms crossed and stared at the floor for a long moment. "Schoolhouse fire was set," Holt said finally. "I found a lamp wick near the back wall that had no business being there." Caleb said nothing. "And that old preacher showed up at my door before sunrise," Holt continued. "Showed me what he had." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I have been sheriff in this town for 11 years. Bellamy has been here for 9 of them." "I know," Caleb said. Holt looked up. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not offering it," Caleb said. "Not yet." Holt accepted that with a short nod. The sound of a wagon reached them from outside, then voices. Caleb moved to the window and felt something loosen in his chest at what he saw. Miriam Vale was coming down the street on foot, walking fast and straight the way she always did, like someone with a purpose and no patience for anything that might slow her down. Beside her, holding Grace wrapped in Mary's quilt, was Anna. Anna's face was pale and drawn from a sleepless night, but her chin was up and her eyes were clear. She had not hidden. She had come. Caleb pressed his hand flat against the cold stone wall. Miriam reached the jail first. She came through the door without knocking and looked at Holt with the expression she probably used on students who had failed a test. They had no excuse to fail. "Tessa Cobb is awake," she said. Her hands are bandaged, but she is sitting up, and she told me herself she will walk into that courtroom this afternoon if someone will hold the door. She set her bag down on the sheriff's desk. The circuit magistrate arrives at noon. We have the original ledger, a living witness, a confession from a frightened clerk who spent last night at my door, and a mother who was locked away and lied to for 15 days. She folded her hands. So I am asking you plainly, Ned Holt, what are you going to do with that badge? Holt stood very still. Then he reached for the key on the wall. He unlocked the cell door and pushed it open and said, I wore this badge too long as decoration, while that man frightened this town. Caleb walked out. He did not say anything to Holt. He walked straight past Miriam and through the door and out into the morning light, where Anna was standing on the boardwalk with Grace. Anna looked at him for one moment and then held Grace out. Caleb took the baby into his arms and held her close, and Grace turned her face against his chest like she had done it 100 times, like she knew the sound of that heartbeat and trusted it completely. She knows you, Anna said softly. Caleb looked down at the baby's small face. No, ma'am, he said. She saved me. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of morning that had no business being so clean after a night of fire and fear. But the sky did not know anything about that. It just sat up there, blue and open, while Mercy Bend woke up slow around them. Miriam did not give the town time to go back to sleep. She gathered them outside the jail and gave each person a task the way a general might before a battle, plain and direct and without room for argument. Caleb would stay close to Anna and Grace. Amos would carry the ledger and nothing else. Tessa, whose hands were wrapped in white cloth from wrist to palm, would come when she was ready, and not a moment before she chose to. Tessa was ready before any of them. She stood on the boardwalk in a dark dress with her bandaged hands folded in front of her, her jaw set tight and her eyes dry. She had the look of a woman who had spent a long night deciding something and had decided it for good. Let us go, she said. Miriam led them down the main street first, letting the town see them. That was intentional. Caleb understood it without being told. Bellamy counted on people staying behind closed doors and curtained windows. The best thing they could do right now was walk in plain daylight where every eye in town could find them. People did look. A man outside the feed store stopped sweeping. 2 women on the far side of the street paused their conversation and watched. A boy sitting on a barrel near the post office stared openly at Anna, and then at the baby in Caleb's arms. They did not stop for any of it. They kept walking. Mercy Refuge sat at the north edge of town, white and still behind its iron fence. The side gates were locked as usual, but the front door opened before Miriam could knock, almost like Matron Clasp had been watching the road. She probably had. Clasp filled the doorway with her straight back and folded hands. Her expression was the same as always, polite on the surface and cold underneath. She looked at Anna first, then at Caleb, then at Amos, and her jaw tightened just slightly. This is a private establishment, she said. Court supervised. The court that supervised it will be answering its own questions this afternoon, Miriam said. We are here to speak with the women in your care, not to you. Clasp began to object, but Amos stepped forward. He was old and small and leaning on his cane, but his voice filled the porch without effort. Eudora, he said quietly, I have buried more people than I can count. I have sat beside the dying and the grieving and the wrongly accused. I know the difference between a house of mercy and a house of control. He looked at her steadily. So do you. Matron Clasp held his gaze for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. The common room was silent when they entered. 6 women sat at their usual sewing work near the windows, but none of them were actually sewing. They were watching the door. They had been watching it, Caleb guessed, since they heard the knock. Anna stepped forward and spoke first. She told them her name, her real name. She said she had been in this house under a different one and had been told her baby died when her baby had not died. She said she was not angry at them. She said she was standing in front of them because she wanted them to know that a person did not have to stay silent just because a powerful man said their words did not count. One woman set down her needlework, then another. A thin woman near the far wall spoke first. Her voice came out rough, like she had not used it freely in a long time. She said she had signed over a property deed in this very house while sick with grief, and that no one had explained what she was signing. Another woman said her medicine had made her sleep for 3 days after her son arrived to ask about her land. Another said she had been told her brother did not want her back. Later she learned he had come twice and been turned away at the gate. The room grew louder slowly, carefully, the way a fire grows when it finally finds enough air. Clasp stood in the doorway and said nothing. By early afternoon, the group that walked toward the courthouse was larger than it had been at sunrise. The widows from Mercy Refuge came in 2s and 3s, some holding each other's arms, some walking alone with their chins lifted. Neighbors who had watched from windows earlier were now walking alongside them. The man from the feed store was there. The 2 women from across the street were there. An older rancher who had lost a water claim to Bellamy 2 years back was there, walking with his hat in his hands and his mouth pressed into a hard, determined line. Tessa walked near the front. Her bandaged hands were at her sides, and she carried a single scorched scrap of paper she had pulled from the burning schoolhouse before falling, a fragment of the flower receipt with Eudora Clasp's signature still visible at the edge of the char. She held it carefully, like it was worth more than it looked. It was. Miriam walked beside her, and inside Miriam's coat, tucked against her side, was Mary's original letter from Anna. It had not burned because Caleb had carried it home from the ranch. That same evening he found it, and it had stayed in his coat pocket since. When Miriam asked him for it that morning, he had handed it over without hesitation. Amos walked at the back of the group, unhurried, the original circuit ledger wrapped in cloth and pressed to his chest with both arms. He moved slowly on account of his limp, but he did not fall behind. He looked like a man who had walked long roads before and knew that steadiness mattered more than speed. Caleb walked beside Anna, who carried Grace. He did not speak. He did not need to. The courthouse steps came into view. Judge Elias Bellamy stood on them. He was dressed as he always was, polished and pressed, not a single thing out of place. He stood with the stillness of a man who was accustomed to watching other people come toward him with problems he had already solved before they arrived. But he was watching the procession moving through his town, and something in his face had shifted. His eyes moved from face to face. The widows, the townspeople, Tessa with her burnt scrap, Miriam with her steady walk, Amos and his wrapped ledger. For the first time since Caleb had laid eyes on Judge Elias Bellamy, the man looked afraid. The circuit magistrate was a compact man with a gray beard and small spectacles that sat low on his nose. His name was Magistrate Holt, and he had traveled 3 counties for 30 years deciding hard things. He did not look easily impressed, and he did not look easily frightened. He sat behind the bench and let his eyes move over the packed courtroom without expression. Every seat was filled. People stood along the back wall. Some stood in the doorway. Bellamy sat at the front table, composed and straight, his hands folded over a stack of papers. He had his court seal ready. He had his forged documents in order. He looked like a man who had already decided how the afternoon would end. Magistrate Holt called the room to order with 2 sharp knocks of his gavel and said, "I will hear testimony. I will not hear speeches. I will not hear interruptions. Anyone who cannot control himself will be removed." His eyes moved briefly to Caleb when he said that last part. Caleb sat still. Bellamy spoke first, because he tried to. He began with legal language about abandoned infants and court jurisdiction and the duty of the bench to protect unstable widows from exploitation. Holt let him speak for 2 minutes, then held up one hand. "I have read your filings, Judge Bellamy," he said. "I would like to hear from the woman." Anna stood. She was pale, and her hands gripped the edge of the witness table, but her voice came out steady. It wavered once at the beginning, and then it did not waver again. She told them about the birth. She told them her daughter had cried, a real cry, a strong one, and that she had heard it clearly before the laudanum pulled her under. She told them how she woke to matron clasp, standing at the foot of the bed saying the baby had been buried before sunrise. She told them about the locked room, and the name Anna Wells, and the months of being told her grief had made her unreliable. She told them about the moment Grace cried in the hallway of Mercy Refuge, and how every part of her body knew the sound before her mind caught up. "I knew my baby," Anna said simply. "A mother knows." The courtroom was very quiet. Amos came next. He unwrapped the ledger slowly and laid it on the witness table with both hands flat on the cover for a moment, like a man at a grave. Then he opened it and read in his steady preacher's voice, "Anna's marriage to Daniel Whitcomb." The Whitcomb homestead entry. Anna's pregnancy recorded by the circuit during a pastoral visit. And the baptism entry written in a midwife's hand, Mercy Grace Whitcomb, born living. Miriam presented Mary's letter. She read the relevant passage aloud without commentary, letting the words do their own work. Anna feared Bellamy. Anna said so in writing. Anna said so months before childbirth. Tessa stood with her bandaged hands and confirmed the flour sack, the delivery to Mercy Refuge, and the woman who had asked for something clean for a baby to travel in. One by one, the widows from Mercy Refuge spoke. Their voices were nervous and plain and completely believable for exactly that reason. Then the former clerk stood up from the third row of the courtroom without being called. He was a thin man with damp hands and a face full of private shame. He said Bellamy had ordered him to enter the infant death record before any burial had occurred. Before any burial. He said he had told himself it was paperwork. He said he knew now it was not. Bellamy rose from his table. His composure finally cracked open, and what came out was not dignity, but appetite. He said the railroad was coming, and that Willow Springs water was too valuable to sit in the hands of a grieving widow and a helpless infant. He said progress required difficult decisions. He said the law existed to serve the future, and that he had served it. Caleb stood up. "Land can be bought," he said. "Water can be claimed. Records can be forged. But a child is not a problem to be solved, and a mother is not a signature to be erased." His voice was quiet, and it carried to every wall. "You called it law because you had a seal, but there is a judge higher than you, Bellamy, and he saw that baby in the dust." The courtroom erupted. Magistrate Holt let it go for 3 seconds, then brought his gavel down hard twice. He voided every one of Bellamy's filings. He restored Anna Whitcomb as the legal mother and guardian of Mercy Grace Whitcomb. He returned Willow Spring Homestead to the Whitcomb line in full. He ordered Bellamy removed from the bench and taken into custody, pending territorial charges for fraud, unlawful confinement, falsification of court records, and conspiracy. Bellamy stood very still while the sheriff crossed the room toward him. The Polish had gone out of his face completely. Silas Drum tried to slip out through the side door. He did not make it. 3 ranchers and 2 mill workers who had spent years stepping aside for him were standing right there. Nobody hit him. Nobody needed to. They simply did not move, and then the deputy had his arm. The room breathed out. Anna sat with Grace pressed against her shoulder, her eyes closed, and her lips moving without sound. Caleb sat beside her and did not speak. There was nothing that needed saying. The next morning, Caleb hitched the wagon before sunrise and drove Anna and Grace out to Willow Spring Homestead. The property had been empty for months. The porch boards needed attention, and the garden had gone to weeds, and the fences along the east pasture were leaning. But the spring itself was running clear and cold and steady, just as it always had, cutting through the dry land like a promise nobody had managed to break. Anna stood at the edge of the porch and looked at it for a long time. Grace made a small sound against her neck. "It is still here," Anna said softly. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. "It is." In the weeks that followed, the neighbors came. They came without being asked, the way people do when they have been quiet too long and finally have something good to put their hands toward. Men repaired fences and replaced porch boards. Women brought curtains and seeds and crockery. Tessa donated lumber from the mill. The church women planted a garden beside the spring, and on the first morning, it showed green. 3 of them cried, and none of them apologized for it. Mercy Refugee, Home for Widows, was reorganized under new management. Miriam oversaw the work, with Tessa and the church women beside her. The locked side gates came off their hinges. The medicine cabinet was cleared out. Women who had been told they were unreliable began slowly to believe otherwise. The railroad surveyors came to Mercy Bend and sat across a table from Anna Whitcomb like she was exactly what she was, the legal owner of the only dependable water source in the valley. The negotiation was honest. The agreement was fair. Anna signed it herself, with Grace asleep in a crib 2 feet away. 1 year after Caleb found the baby in the dust, the town gathered at the old wagon road to place a sign. It was a simple thing, painted wood on a post. The letters were neat and black, and the whole town could read them from where they stood. Grace Road. Caleb stood with Anna on one side of him and little Mercy Grace on the other, chubby-cheeked and wide-eyed and entirely unaware of what the sign meant. She reached for it anyway, the way babies reach for anything bright, and Anna laughed, and Amos said a short blessing, and the crowd around them made the kind of noise that has no word except joy. They rode home at sunset, the 3 of them on the wagon bench. The land glowed gold on both sides of the road. The spring at Willow Spring caught the last light and threw it back at the sky. The air smelled like dry grass and something cooler underneath, the kind of evening that makes a person feel the world is larger and kinder than they remembered. Grace slept between them, wrapped in Mary's quilt. Her fist was curled against her cheek, and her breathing was the slow, easy breathing of a child who has never once doubted she was safe. Caleb held the reins loosely. Anna sat close beside him with her shoulder warm against his arm. "You could have ridden past," Anna said. "I nearly did," Caleb answered. "But you didn't." "No." He watched the road ahead, golden and long and familiar. "And every good thing in my life came after that." Anna's hand moved across the quilt and settled over his. Grace sighed in her sleep. Caleb looked at the road where he had found her, just dust and distance and the last red light of the day, and understood that it was no longer a place of grief. It was the place where God had handed him back his heart. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.